Welcome to the World Bank's Praxis Discussion Series. I'm Oscar Sabakti. I'd like to welcome our audience here in Sydney, those watching on APAC online and listening on radio, and everyone watching in Dili and Port Moresby. There's little doubt that technology has changed the way we live in almost every part of the world. Mobile phone access has now reached 3/4 of the planet's population. Governments, services and money are going mobile in developing countries, with simple, easy access technology being used for everything from providing basic information to making cash payments to disaster relief. In the Pacific, one of the most dispersed regions on Earth, more than 2 million more people gained access to mobile phones over the last few years, while high-speed internet is connecting Tonga from Fiji later this month. But what does this mean for local communities, business and governments? Is technology a threat or an asset to Pacific cultures? How can developing countries tap into the benefits of the mobile revolution? And what's been the impact of social media? To discuss these issues and more, we're joined by Sarah Logan from the Department of International Relations at the ANU, Michael Bergmann, who's the Assistant Director General for Governance and Social Development at AusAID, and Gerard McCarthy, the Director of Asia Pacific Projects at TechChange. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Oscar.
Now, firstly, Michael, if I can throw to you, development agencies like AusAID and the World Bank meet very pressing immediate needs, such as health and education and disease. Why should a development agency care about mobile phones?
Thanks, Oscar. The use of technology, as you say, is increasing. It's happening, whether we sort of want to push it or stand back and watch it happen. From a development agency's perspective, I think some of the more interesting questions are also around what can this technology do as a tool within our other programs. So you can look at the question as you positioned it, that should we just throw money at infrastructure, throw money at development of mobile phone technology within the Pacific, but also have a look at the question of how can we integrate it within our other development programs. And there's some really interesting stuff happening around the Pacific, which I can provide you some examples if you'd like. But essentially, I think it's the technology as the tool for development outcomes, and as long as we can examine that question rather than getting caught up in the technology itself, we can sort of progress that development agenda.
Sarah, what do you think? Is this focus on ICT, including that dreaded word apps, which is that we all know and love these days, is it just a fad in the development area?
Well, I think aside from apps, which is, people get a little bit overexcited about that concept, but I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that there is a lot of excitement around this issue. There is a lot of evangelism, hard research on outcomes, particularly when it comes to things like governance, is yet to really emerge. But that doesn't mean that we should dismiss it out of hand as a fad. We can see real economic impacts. We can see social change occurring, as a result of or in congruence with the emergence of new technologies. So yeah, I don't think it's a fad.
So it's here to stay, basically?
Well, there's nothing we can do about it. It's here to stay, yeah.
And Gerard, what kind of innovations are we seeing globally, particularly in technologies that could be useful in development? Are there any examples in the Pacific, or is there potential for that to be applied in the Pacific?
So I think we're seeing an interesting shift that's happened over the last sort of 4 or 5 years. With a shift, I think, from sort of a one-way communication channel in terms of use of mobile phones to sort of a two-way dialogue between citizens and their governments, and to NGOs and other sort of service providers. And a good example of that is a platform called AusAID, which is a mapping platform developed in Kenya. It was initially sort of brought together to map electoral violence in the 2007 Kenyan electoral violence that occurred. And it's sort of an interesting mix of sort of Google Maps meets sort of text messages, where you basically text message in information. This is what they solicited during the electoral violence, information about incidents of electoral violence. And they were able to basically aggregate that to a single account and then map those incidents of violence. And they tried to make that something where they could respond in the moment. And we've gotten a lot better at responding to those sort of reports now. And there's a lot of, there's a huge area that Sarah knows a lot about of sort of digital humanitarianism. We've got networks of people that can, interpret those text messages in real time. But what the extraordinary capability of that sort of platform is to actually have a two-way dialogue. So instead of just being able to get information from someone about an instance of electoral violence, or as it was later used, Ushahidi was deployed in the Haitian earthquake, to be able to map where people were within the rubble, for instance. And they had one maternity unit, for instance, in the first 48 hours after the earthquake in Haiti. They were able to use this platform. They distributed the number to text to via radio networks and mobile networks, and then able to plot that information as to where people were and how they should allocate their maternity, squadron, for instance.
And potentially, I guess, with the Pacific prone to disasters and with, I guess, the health problems that exist in the region, that sort of a thing could be happening in the Pacific.
Absolutely, and I think we're seeing increasingly a willingness to deploy these sorts of technologies, particularly with alert systems. So you've actually got, we were talking about earlier, Vanuatu, for instance, and a number of other countries are trialling alert systems around disaster management. But it also helps in sort of, in individual projects, in managing sort of health data, for instance, and being able to, I think, have a deeper understanding as to what the, local conditions are, so that you're not just relying on, a couple of government bureaucrats, for instance, about what the conditions of, malaria in a particular area is, or, HIV, for instance, that you can actually, for instance, run mobile polls increasingly, so you can actually get information as to what people's needs are and better respond to those needs. But I think there's also a broader conversation about the institutional implications of this sort of two-way communication on political structures as well.
And we'll touch on that later on, but a country like Solomon Islands is made up of some 950 islands, and it's not unlike many other Pacific island nations in the region. Sarah, does ICT have more of a role in connecting these communities given this unique environment?
I think it's really important to think about what is specific to the Pacific when it comes to thinking about the impact of this technology, where there are lots of lessons we can learn, we can draw from other places like, Sub-Saharan Africa, East Africa, so on, places that ostensibly share many characteristics with the Pacific. But the Pacific has issues of, distance, which exist really nowhere else. Issues, issues of literacy, governance, all sorts of things that are combined to sort of form a perfect storm, if you like, in many ways. So I think ICT is useful in bridging distance and sort of making inroads into sort of the limited media landscape that exists across the Pacific. There's, I think in PNG there was 2% landline penetration. Well, still probably is. That's pretty low. So there's some really serious inroads being made there. In PNG at the moment, I think the penetration rate for mobile phones is between 35 and 40%. So that's a huge increase there, and I would say it is important, but it comes with particular barriers.
I think you're seeing that across the Pacific as well. That sort of leapfrogging from, we've skipped the era of copper wiring to every house or the phone line, right? So we've skipped computers. So you've skipped straight to smart, internet on smartphones, and the projections is that, something like 50% of PNG would have access to internet via their mobile phone. By I think it's 2020, is it? It's in the next decade or so, and I mean that's an interesting dynamic in terms of just skipping infrastructure that would have 20 years ago been vital for this kind of communication.
And there's been a rapid proliferation of ICT across the Pacific, as we've touched on. There's been a lot of investment, a lot of development, a lot of change in such a short amount of time. And I mean, just recently we've seen the introduction of high-speed internet in Tonga, or I think it's about to happen. But Michael, can I ask you, what's the evidence that these technologies will have a positive effect on development in this region?
At the sort of country macroeconomic level, there's been quite a few studies that will point to figures such as a 10% increase in mobile phone penetration will increase GDP in a less developed or middle income country by around 1.2% of GDP. So those sorts of studies and those sorts of figures are out there.
And that's quite a significant figure, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think how we, again, the specificness of the Pacific is interesting. Most of these sorts of studies have to date been undertaken either in Africa or South Asia or East Asia, and translating them directly. There can be dangers translating this sort of approach directly to the Pacific, but I think the general understanding that if you increase a community's ability to access information, access markets through the use of ICT, then you will have positive economic benefits. It's what our economists tell me, and I try not to disagree with them. But that's that's at that sort of macro level. At the project and program level, because we're dealing with a reasonably it's still nascent field. A lot of the sort of impact evaluations are still either ongoing or haven't given us the sort of strong evidence that donors particularly like to build our programs on. So I think providing a bit more support as well to gather that evidence to make sure we understand how that can be translated to a Pacific context is still necessary, but at the higher level the benefits I think can be reasonably assumed to occur.
But is it more than just, I guess, the existence of this technology? It's about how it's applied, I gather. So
yeah, absolutely, and this sort of goes back to my first point in AusAID trying to look at our programs that we're already implementing and see how ICT or how mobile technology can be integrated within those programs. Our health program in Papua New Guinea, for example, are doing some work around. I guess make sure I get the name right, the sort of childbirth emergency phone, where mobile phones, again, reasonably dumb phone technology, not particularly, can be provided to rural health workers who are able to talk to doctors in provincial hospitals when there's a complication in a delivery. And we've got 5 women dying every day in Papua New Guinea through childbirth complications. And trying to integrate technology into that approach, even at a very simple level. But again, trying to position that within a broader discussion around what other infrastructure is required. It's nice to have a phone, but if you're not tying it with maybe a solar charger or the broader ability to actually use the thing, you're missing out. So positioning it within not only a program context, but a cultural context, a geographic context is very important.
I think another dynamic there is to also place it within its proper sort of sociological context as well, right? So urbanisation is obviously a good example where you've got rural communities that are urbanising partly because of job opportunities, but also because of weak health service delivery and weak education availability within those areas. And in particularly on the health side, there's very strong arguments for investing in sort of patient data management, for instance, quite basic sort of systems that wouldn't remove the incentive for people to urbanise, but in some ways would actually ease the way in which patient care is provided. Also, there's increasing use of inventory management. It sounds so basic, but having an understanding as to what rural clinics actually have in terms of pharmaceutical availability, and having an understanding as to how they equip them. There's interesting cases of use of drones, for instance, in Malawi to linked with a mobile phone to be able to deliver urgent medical supplies to rural areas of Malawi. And that's a pretty extraordinary example of improving rural health services. But there's also the urban side, which is helping to map informal settlements. We're seeing a lot of difficulty responding to the pace of urbanisation, particularly in PNG and in Fiji, and how you actually manage that understanding what services are needed, what new infrastructure, whether it's electricity or water upgrades. I think ICT plays a role in that. It shouldn't design around technology, but you have to actually understand the broader context and build a strategy around what role it plays.
Sarah, you touched on the vastness, I guess, of this region, and I think it's unique in the world in that sense. What are the challenges in implementing this sort of technology? Is it just the distance, or are there any other challenges that might impede the implementation of mobile technology?
Well, I think there are lots of challenges, like there is with any sort of new regulatory environment or infrastructure delivery project. Regulation is a challenge in the Pacific. Maintenance, like any infrastructure issue in the Pacific, maintenance of towers, all that sort of thing. But also cost. I think that's something that we often forget. For us here, cost, not really an issue when it comes to ICT. But studies show again and again that for people in the Pacific and elsewhere in the developing world, the cost of mobile technology is a barrier. People will budget around it because they see it as a priority. In general, there's some great studies that suggest that people will budget, will drop their food budgets to keep a communication budget going if they see it as providing a particular good. But it's still an issue. There was a study that I was reading the other day of 60 farmers in Eastern Highlands Province, 90% of whom say they use their phones for agricultural purposes, and all of them complain about the cost. They say we would use it more, except we can't afford it.
So how can we get around this problem? How can governments, how can development agencies get around this issue of cost when people still need to eat and still need to put a roof over their heads? So why should they be worried about whether or not they have enough credit on their phones?
Well, I think I'm not sure that it is, and you might correct me on this, I'm not sure that it is a development agency's job to ensure that people can afford credit for their phones. It's not, as part of a broader poverty reduction agenda for sure, but maybe a different way to think about it is facilitating people to make choices about how they spend their income and to increase that income more broadly. And also I think the work that the World Bank and AusAID have done on regulatory environments and competition and things like that, they in effect deal with that issue. It's just happening slowly, that's all.
Yeah. Do you agree, or should a development agency have other priorities?
I think Sarah's point is well taken. The ability to work with government is one of the things that someone from government can do reasonably well, we hope. So working in the regulatory environment, making sure that the market is open enough for new players to come in to bring those costs down is something that I think the role of a government is well taken. But could go back to your question about whether it's our role to see whether someone can charge up their phone or not. It's the role of a development agency to make sure that people have the ability to act on their choices and to implement the choices that they want to undertake to improve their lives. And if being able to use a communications tool is a choice of a particular family that they see that as a benefit to be able to, again, as I said, access markets or just talk to friends and family or access remittances from people living overseas, then creating that space is I think something that a development agency should be able to work with.
Gerard, can I ask you, you've mentioned some of the positive things about this technology, but how can we ensure that everyone benefits from this technology, not just urban populations or the elites?
I think that you have to put sort of the technology in its place to some degree conceptually. So I think you have to understand that you can't expect a series of fairly technocratic solutions to data management or whatever to significantly change people's lives and the way that they're lived. And I think you have to understand that it is a very big sort of institutional implication for a lot of these technologies. And I sort of think about this in a similar way to Tess Newton-Kane, who's a fellow at the Development Policy Centre at ANU, who talks about sort of the supply and demand for open government and how ICTs play a role in providing a platform for people to call governments to account and ensure that the services that are provided are not provided on a political basis to win votes, for instance, but are provided on a fairly accountable basis, whether that's through opening their budgets and the way that they actually spend funds to civil society groups and providing on the sort of demand side tools for those civil society groups, whether it's campaigning tools, skills to be able to use mobile phones, very basic communication tools to build campaigns around that sort of open government, access to budgets, having understanding that there hasn't perhaps been a dedication to health budgets as there should have been throughout the Pacific. And I think that's the point at which you have to put the broader schema of good governance and couple it with the ICT side and understand that that's where you're going to get the really inclusive benefits of this sort of ICT revolution.
Okay, let's now look at one aspect of this mobile technology that is controversial, not only in the Pacific but also in the West, and that's social media. Facebook, Twitter, the list can go on. Countries in the West see this as a blessing or a curse. We've seen examples of social media being used in, obviously, the Arab Spring. It's been credited with helping that move along, but also in the Iranian elections and other such instances. How much of a role does social media play in the Pacific in terms of democratising communities? Perhaps could we even see a Pacific Spring down the track? Is there potential for that? Gerard, you've been examining situations around the world. Can this happen in the Pacific?
So it's actually a very interesting question, and Sarah can talk a little bit about sort of how the Pacific is a lot different from, for instance, the Middle East. I actually just finished running a course for sort of 30 civil society activists from across the Pacific. One of the sort of the key themes that came out from that course was actually how, in some ways, social media platforms, it's by no means ubiquitous, for instance. We're not talking about 60% of the population sitting on Facebook having conversations about politics, but there are these emerging platforms that are still highly urban, for instance, and they are, in many ways, limited to the, 10-12% of people who actually have access to internet. So we have to be a little bit cautious about some sort of generalisation about some social media revolution. But there's interesting points about how similar a lot of these online platforms are in terms of similarity to village life. Being able to actually sit in a circle and have a conversation with political actors and being able to have a fairly frank conversation in which you call them to account. And that's where I think that there's, we're not seeing a huge transformation as to how sort of, political processes might be occurring. You're certainly broadening the net, and you're broadening the kind of voices that are part of that conversation. And it's not going to transform the region, but, it's certainly happening on a small basis, yeah.
I think the way we can think about this usefully is in terms of your point about Ict acting as an enabler and a facilitator and an intensifier. Yeah. So if we look back to the demonstrations that happened during the constitutional crisis in PNG last year, what we saw were very large, peaceful organisations in which social media played a role in terms of organising, and email played a role, mobile phones played a role. But what also played a role were established civil society organisations, churches, trade unions, student organisations. We can't sort of point to causation really, but we can see something happening, and it's important to recognise that. And even with, say, the House Cry demonstrations last month, that was quite extraordinary, I think. Demonstrations up and down the east coast of Australia, across PNG, and indeed around the world. There was a small gathering in London, for example. That was interesting because a lot of it happened, if not all of it happened, as far as I can tell, happened via social media, mobile phones, internet, ICT enabled. But what that did, I think, is tap into kind of broader church faith-based networks. I've been looking at it, trying to work out where it came from, and it looks like it was started by women from a group called Women Arise, which is a church-based group in Ley. And what it did was provide a framework which women's groups around the country and around the world could latch onto quickly and easily and move with. So it's a facilitator certainly, but not a cause necessarily.
And on that, I mean, the constitutional crisis in PNG last year, with 10,000 people being able to mobilise and congregate in a particular area. But I've read some reports from people who were there who were saying one of the more important things to getting those numbers together wasn't what part of it was the technology, but part of it was the choice to march rather than hop on a bus and congregate together, which then build up a sort of a communal behind it. And again, that's very old school. That's very low tech. But again, the people would say, well, why did we choose to march? Because of the lessons that we heard from other social movements around the world, and those lessons were gained over Facebook and using technology. So it's an interesting sort of intermix between really traditional grassroots movements and techniques and the use of technology to, as you say, mobilise and
a lot of which are quite old techniques as well.
In many parts of the world, we've seen social media change the way we interact with each other, bypassing or reducing traditional channels. Sarah, do you think that social media has the potential to weaken tradition, culture and norms in the Pacific?
Well, I think cultural norms in the Pacific are pretty persistent. I'm not sure that Facebook is going to have the impact that people think it will on cultural and traditional norms, and it's part of a broader modernisation process. But one thing that does come up again and again in the Pacific are people's fears about this new technology and what it's going to do to those processes and norms, and the bad influences that it brings, things like pornography, ideas about women's role in modern life. So I'm not sure that is necessarily a weakening process, but it's definitely something that people are worried about. And I mean, if we look, for example, at what happens with women in politics online in PNG, we have a lot of young women online. There's studies showing that young women in PNG have as much access to mobile phones as their male counterparts. That's interesting and important. But it didn't stop people filming Kapaila Nyari. She was filmed, that video was shared. The phones did nothing to stop that happening. So in some ways, the technology doesn't, it doesn't dissolve. It doesn't necessarily liberate. In some ways, it can entrench. I think some of the research shows around gender roles and mobile phones in PNG suggests that women, as always, are bearing the brunt of people's fears about this new technology and are being accused of using the technology for marital affairs and so on. I mean, they may be, I don't know, but I think the point is that it doesn't dissolve old gender roles. And I think we can apply that to other cultural norms as well.
So in your research or observations, you have seen significant pushback from these communities?
Everyone I speak to in the Pacific raises it. And I think it's really important to bear that in mind. People are excited, definitely, but also concerned. So
perhaps some sort of a awareness campaign or an education campaign to increase digital literacy is important in this case. Would you agree? To teach people how to properly use these technologies.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we're still struggling here with the proper way to use these technologies, but what can be done is sort of facilitated open discussions with people with moral authority like church leaders about what this technology means. Being scared of it, trying to stop it, is really not going to work. What people think I need is in my humble opinion, what people might need is opportunities and facilities to have open, moderated discussions about an issue that concerns them, like any other issue like that.
Gerard, we touched on, or you mentioned the way Twitter, Facebook, or these other social media platforms are being used by several governments and leaders. We've got Barack Obama, he's a prolific tweeter. The Dalai Lama, the Pope, they're all on Twitter. They're probably not tweeting themselves, but how can... But we've seen how Pacific leaders jump on these platforms as well and interact directly with their citizens. Does this make them more accountable to their citizens?
I think you have to take it with a grain of salt in terms of just saying that you've got a politician who's on Facebook and therefore you're going to improve service delivery. I mean, there's a lot of causal mechanisms that are happening there, right? So I think a really interesting shift that's occurring is that sort of citizen engagement and political openness is happening with a broader sort of open government movement. So that sort of opening of budgets, as I was saying earlier, as well as a willingness to engage with civil society groups in not just saying here's what we're spending, but in a participatory budgetary sense. And a lot of that's happening online, and because of the breadth of the audience, you're actually getting much more local issues coming out about how whether you fund services and that sort of thing. But what you're seeing is, social media, politicians being online is not necessarily going to just, that's not a solution, right? You actually need to have a broader movement. There's a fantastic initiative called the Open Government Partnership, and we're seeing a couple of countries across the Pacific sign up to the Open OGP, as well as Australia most recently, which is a fantastic initiative. So I mean, that's the sort of thing that we need to couple with that broader movement towards citizen engagement if we're really going to see some change.
Michael, can I ask you, coming from AusAID, governance is obviously an important issue for, I guess, any development agency in the work that you do. How does social media, or indeed this technology, affect that aspect of your work, or just governance generally?
Well, I might build on what Gerard was saying around open data. I think there's some lessons coming out of Africa around the Kenyan Open Data Portal, where a lot of effort was gone into putting all sorts of government data, census data, school service level information on the internet. 400 data sets, I think, is the last count, maybe a few more, since 2011. So getting that information out there. But there was quite a lot of sort of high expectations. That information was put out there then what happens? And the pickup and the use of that, and being able to analyse it, being able to tell a narrative, tell a story about why does this matter?
Yeah.
It wasn't until, and again, it's a World Bank initiative that through the Governance Partnership Facility, which Australia's a contributor towards, started working towards a project called Code for Kenya, which worked with media outlets, civil society groups, and tried to embed fellows within these institutions to be able to work with that data, to analyse it, to interrogate it, and do interesting things with it. And some of them were apps, but being able to say, okay, well, what does that tell me about this particular hospital close to me? Does it provide these particular services, or do I need to travel somewhere else to get them? All those sorts of activities, I think, linking that for want of a better shorthand, the demand and the supply of governance. It's happening, and trying to understand and position it within an existing framework of openness and transparency is probably going to be the most effective way.
Okay, so on balance, we've heard good things about these new technologies. We've also heard very bad things about these technologies. On balance, is this a good or a bad thing for the Pacific?
It's happening. I don't think there's... we have to respond to the situation as it is, right? And you can't think that you can fight against this wave of freer information flows. A good example that's sort of recently come up in the Fiji debate about whether they should have internet censorship, particularly for pornography, is the metaphor of a highway. That you've built this highway where information moves extremely quickly, and the question is what the trade-off is of setting up roadblocks along that way of filtering and censorship to try and mitigate some of those negative effects. When you actually might be really countervailing it and blocking off some of the more productive impacts. And I think working with some of those networks, I mean the churches, as you were talking about in our conversation earlier, Sarah, the churches in PNG, for instance, are only now starting to cotton on to the benefits and potential of ICTs in their own sort of evangelisation, for instance. And I think that's an interesting sort of flip side where there's a realisation happening across a variety of different institutions that there may well be a prevalence of pornography, but there's also increasing number. There's a pluralism of actors, for instance, coming online. They're able to use those tools, and I don't think it's worth shutting them down because you actually lose the productivity that they offer.
Sarah, do you agree? You mentioned some very disturbing uses of this technology in the Pacific. Not all of the Pacific, we should add. Yeah. Do you think this development has been a welcome one, or not so well? As Gerard said, it's happening.
Lots of people are worried about it. Lots of people are really happy about it. I mean, my Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islander friends on Facebook are very happy about it. And I think that we have to think about, aside from the social effects, which are, people are worried about, the economic impacts, as Michael said, are kind of broadly unavoidable. And I think, so for example, one story that really strikes me in the Pacific is the BSP mobile banking story. So the Bank of South Pacific introduced mobile banking in 2011. In 2012, they had, I've got it here, 320,000 registrations and 6.8 million transactions in 2012. That's extraordinary. That's access to financial services using a particular technology that did not exist before. And again, we don't know what people are doing with those accounts, so we don't know what their transactions were for, sure, but something really big is happening, and it looks positive from here.
Okay, let's now open to questions from the floor and from overseas as well. We've got a question from Dili in Timor-Leste. The country has recently liberalised its telecommunications sector. What changes are happening and what can we expect to happen as a result? This person's speaking from East Timor. Can any one of you speak in that context?
Well, one of the things that's interesting about East Timor is obviously the post-conflict situation. It makes it different perhaps to other places in the Pacific, although the Seoul is another useful example there. Well, I think given our discussion, what people in East Timor can expect is some economic impacts, sure, some social impacts, definitely. But again, there are particular features of that environment that you have to consider. One of them is the broader media environment. So how does it change, how will it change how people get their news? I know that the number of radio stations in Timor is declining, for example. What does that mean for how people get news and think about access to information? There are language issues in Timor that don't necessarily exist elsewhere. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think given our discussion, yeah, social and economic effects, but what, we can't say yet.
I think it's very difficult to predict. As I said, all countries are unique. We can hopefully predict a lessening in prices, but we've got to understand that that won't automatically happen consistently across all levels of community. In a lot of, I think a survey put out mentioned that women in low-income and middle-income countries are 20% less likely to have access to a mobile phone than men. So what does this mean? Or how about a rural community if they're not going to be able to put a tower up there because the population density is just not enough for a private company to make a profit? You can have service agreements in a deregulated market. So all these sort of questions have to look at. I think the benefits are there, but they won't necessarily happen automatically.
Gerard, we've got another question here from Dilly. This one's from Fatima from UNDP. Access to the informal economy emerges from mobile phones, from cash transfers to new business opportunities. How can development agencies leverage this, and have you seen this happen?
Very good question. There is tremendously strong evidence that particular access to mobile banking transforms the way that households manage risk and respond to external shocks, for instance. So whether it's a drop in the price of their agricultural good and therefore a drop in their household income. And what we've seen in Kenya, where 70% of financial transactions occur via mobile banking, which is an extraordinary figure when you think about, it's minute in Australia, for instance. But the reality of that is that households now are able, through the mobile banking platform, which is called M-Pesa in Kenya, actually receive remittances from a very broad network of people instantaneously almost. So basically what you've seen is that when if you're short $20 to pay your children's school fees that week because the cost of wheat or corn has dropped, you're actually able to access small amounts of money from your friends. And we're seeing that in some parts of the Pacific. PNG, for instance, and Digicel's sort of emergence across the Pacific is introducing mobile banking, and that's the sort of particularly on an informal basis, an ability to transfer those small amounts of money is vital for how our households respond to risk. And I think it's fairly early days in the Pacific, and there's some great study that's been done by the Pacific Institute for Public Policy on Vanuatu, but I'd love to see some similar studies across the Pacific with a better understanding as to how households are actually using these tools, what they're actually spending their money on, and a variety of different usage sort of statistics, so we can actually structure our programs and training a bit better.
Okay, can I take a question from Sydney? Does anyone have a question here? Yes, ma'am.
My name is Usha Raman. I'm from India, and we've been talking about the benefits and about the benefits from the ability to collect all this different kind of data, but a huge sort of complementary concern to that is the possibility of surveillance of different kinds. So what would you say about that?
It's a really good question. It's particularly pertinent given the current, NSA leaks and that sort of thing. I think there's my opinion on that balance is that people are willing to trade off that, particularly that sense of privacy about metadata, for instance, or that this sort of big buzzword about big data, for instance. People are willing to make that trade-off when there's transparency about how it's going to be used, I think that's the reason why we're all somewhat scandalised about how the US has been monitoring it, and to some degree in Australia as well. And I think that you really need to couple that conversation about data and sort of transparency with a broader open government initiative, right? So you can't just say we're going to make all budgets or we're going to mine people's data without having a process that's clear and without having a plan as to how you engage with society groups and ensure that there's some transparency. So I think there's a balance that needs to be struck.
Can I just jump in there? I don't actually think surveillance is an issue in the Pacific. In Fiji, okay, separate case. But I think that there's severe capacity constraints when it comes to actual government surveillance in the Pacific. We've seen instances of censorship, again, leaving Fiji to one side where there is capacity, in attempted censorship of online discussions in the Sols and PNG, for example, none of which have been effective. I think it's something to be cognizant of, and I think in the Fiji case, it's definitely important to think about pressure put on ISPs when it comes to, general freedom of speech issues as part of a more general approach to media freedom. But yeah, in terms of actual surveillance, it's a very different position. And also, I think one interesting question that is raised by that is the idea of information culture. So, is privacy the same everywhere? What does privacy mean in a Melanesian context? I mean, I might be sort of being over-relativist here, but I'm not sure that I am. The information culture refers to the way that people think about public identity, private identity, truth, falsity, how information is perceived as true, why, how it is shared, and what that means. I think those are issues we have to think about when we think about the impact of this technology in the Pacific.
Do we have another question from Sydney? Sir.
There's been some discussion about cost of technology, but not about price. The actual market for supply of technology in the Pacific is not at all competitive, and I wonder whether there are ways in which you can be encouraged to be more competitive. I can give an example. This may sound rather peculiar, and it's not really applicable to the Pacific, but The Economist reported in 2005 that Somalia had the cheapest and highest quality mobile phone service in Africa.
And the longest average call minutes, it's about 69 minutes or something.
Yeah.
Wow.
And the reason for that was Somalia had no government. So it had, it had no communication ministry, it had no bureaucrats, it had nobody to bribe apart from some minor bribes to warlords. So firms moved in, put up their towers, and off they went. Now, I don't suppose you could possibly do that in PNG, but
Didn't happen in the same way in PNG, but the way that Digicel entered the market was very fast, very feisty. There was no sitting, didn't appear to be from this end, and much sitting around negotiating endlessly with rent seekers.
oh,
Yeah.
thank you.
So can the cost of these technologies, are governments likely to cash in on this, or can private operators do what they want and in effect, I guess, reduce the cost of these services? I mean, what's happening in the Pacific?
Well, I think the evidence shows that the private sector is in the Pacific. Costs are dropping. Whatever deals might have to be done with government and whatever rent-seeking behaviour might be exhibited by government, it's there. But I think one thing we have to think about is, despite the opening up of markets, there is still not that much competition in the Pacific. So
There's not much competition in Australia.
Exactly. Well, I think in PNG, for example, Digicel's done a great job, but it's now essentially, according to some people, a monopoly. And the ISP sort of access to cables has only just been deregulated in PNG. That's just now. So it's not over yet.
Can we? Oh, sorry, Michael.
Sorry, just to quickly finish up on that, and quite often I think we need to ask ourselves why these reforms haven't happened in the past, and it's not always because there's a rent-seeking environment, or people just didn't know that if you deregulate your telecommunications industry, chances are that services will be able to increase and costs will come down. These are complex political environments that we're working in, and being able to understand the different drivers of change within an environment, within a country, to be able to understand what is holding back or driving regulatory reform is vital. So it's moving away from this one-size-fits-all that, if only you deregulate your telecommunications industry, chances are people have thought of that in the past. There might be other blockers that are stopping that.
I think there's definitely an educational process that needs to occur. I mean, across ministries, we're getting a lot of interest in, just having understanding as to the role of mobile phones in agricultural extension and rural health, for instance. And when you start to diversify those touch points of what ICTs are used for, you start to get that kind of high level commitment. We've seen that in Vanuatu. The chief regulator there and the chief information officer is extraordinarily enthusiastic about ICTs, and certainly you can't take away the political economy of the operating environment, but there is definitely an educational process that needs to happen across the region. Yeah.
I've got a question for Sarah from Port Moresby. With social media, real voices are being lost because so few people have access to the internet. Do you have a view on this?
Well, I think the question depends on how much notice is taken of social media. If we think that social media is providing an avenue to government that is actually effective and having an impact, then maybe I think we can say that if that is an emerging avenue of access, then people without access to social media are missing out. But I think we have to confirm first that social media is emerging as a way to access government. I think Sharp Talk is a prominent Facebook group for Papua New Guineans. There's a really interesting example there. Anecdotally, there's a Sharp Talk users group for MPs that meets in Waigani. And you'll see MPs pop up on Sharp Talk all the time and engage in issues. That suggests that there is some sort of access happening there that's not available to people who don't have access to social media. But yeah, I think we'd have to confirm the first part first before we can answer the second.
Got another question from Moresby as well. PNG has a population of 7 million, 1% has internet access. What can be done to improve this?
I think the stat is 2%, but yes,
2%?
It's really low. Yeah, but those stats are quite old now. I think Digicel introduced mobile broadband in 2011, I think, and we haven't seen the stats since then about what effect that's had on internet access.
But you assume that access has increased?
I'm assuming that, yeah. It's still really expensive, and I think the main thing that we could do to improve that situation would be to reduce the cost. But how we do that is a much more complex question.
Any other thoughts to how to increase the accessibility to the internet?
I'd be careful about intervening too much. I mean, there's a need for, particularly in PNG, greater competition in the market. But from a technological perspective, I mean, the real benefit lies in the proliferation of extremely cheap smartphones. 30, 40 bucks for a relatively simple smartphone, but one that's able to access internet. That's the kind of thing that we're really going to see transform from a handset device perspective. But the cost of data, for instance, that needs to be a huge focus, and extra competition in the PNG market is a key driver of that, I think.
Okay, do we have another question from Sydney? Ma'am.
Hi, my name's Jo Bishop. I work for Optus. We've done a fair bit of research of late on looking at technology and how it works in the international development sector, trying to get our head around how that works from a regional perspective for the Asia Pacific, but also from the global market. A lot of what we've found is that customers tend to fit into two camps. You have your customers who work for either your government or for your organisations that look at it from a very governance kind of context and what they can do with the data that they have and how they can meet and communicate with or connect with their customers or their citizens, if you want to put it that way. And then we see a lot of from a customer perspective, it's more about, well, how can I leverage what I'm doing in a social context to be able to really motivate and get out there? And we kind of see it from a perspective that we're reaching, I guess they coin it as a digital era. And how do we transform ourselves for a digital era? And mobility really is a key foundation stone for that. But as we're kind of entering this era, much of what we see is really around people learning how to use the technology. Much of what you've said before, how do you understand it, but also how do you use it? So a lot of it is really about that education process and understanding and learning what others are doing so that they can maximise and benefit from that. So for example, from a international development sector, you may have those working in the agriculture sector who the agriculture context who are looking at, well, how do I take that so that if I'm a rural farmer, how do I then use that technology so that I can access new trade groups or sell my crops to whomever or plant different crops depending on the seasons or the climate or things like that. So how do you leverage that information? So it's really around a data perspective. How do I either upload my data so that my citizens or my customers can understand it, or how do I leverage that data, even from an educational context and educating school children or anything like that. I mean, even in a Western society, my kids use social media to be able to practice their spelling and practice their mathematics and things like that. And there's nothing preventing Pacific Islanders from doing the same. So I was wondering if you could comment on that a little bit more.
I mean, it's a really interesting point, and I'm really glad that you raised it, because it is essentially what I do.
Well, it's great to have someone from a telco here to talk about it as well.
And thank you for coming. Yeah, I mean, I think the first point I want to make is that you have to be willing to engage in the analytical questions about technology, and not just think that particular device is going to transform communities or the way people live their lives. So there's analytical questions there about information flows and about feedback mechanisms for government, and there's a huge role. And that's TechChange is an educational institution. We run online courses in exactly what you're talking about. And our focus is technologically agnostic. We don't sell any products. We don't have any apps. We simply teach people and provide them the tools with an understanding of the kind of, whether it's data management, whether it's rural, agriculture or health, what kind of questions and what kind of tools might be relevant to help answer those questions. And it's absolutely, you're spot on. I think a lot of it is an educational process. People have to understand what's actually the potential of these tools. And it will happen slowly without any assistance, but I think we can speed that process up and also share sort of global best practice to some extent.
I've got a question here. It's either from Port Moresby or from Timor. Many well-known platforms, Facebook and Twitter, have come from rich, developed countries. Are we starting to see evidence of these sorts of technologies or apps even coming from the developing countries themselves, either in the Pacific or elsewhere, that are aimed directly for these populations?
Can I just jump in there? I think, well, yes, definitely. I mean, that's what a big part of Kenya's ICT economy, for example, is emerging as kind of and also other places in East Africa and elsewhere. Yeah, people are able to divine new ways of using the technology that are specific to the developing world, and then make money out of that. It's happening already. I don't think we've seen that in the Pacific yet.
It's beginning. There's sort of tentative steps into that. Indonesia is a little closer to the area. There's hackathons where people are getting together to try and develop apps. The US State Department have done a little bit of work in this around the first Pacific Tech Camp, where they brought young people together in Fiji to work on different apps, coding, developing, designing, to address questions that they themselves wanted to be able to address. So yeah, it's beginning, but it's nowhere. I don't think we're as it's a start.
So could we see perhaps a Silicon Valley starting up in the Pacific somewhere one day, potentially?
I would hope so. Yeah.
But the great thing about the technology being able to shrink borders means that there's no reason why you can't code anywhere. Once you've been able to get the basic infrastructure, and some of the submarine cables that are now being rolled out across the Pacific will, I think, hopefully go a long way to that. Some of the work the University of the South Pacific's trying to do with their own network as well, to try and link educational institutions around the Pacific, is going to help in that regard. But you can code anywhere. So.
Okay, well, we've got time for one more question. Does anyone in Sydney have a final question?
I've spent nearly half of the last 40 years in the Pacific in the field and worked with traditional cultures in North Africa and the Sahara and South America. Back to basics. Okay, technology is okay, but as some of the chiefs in more remote areas of Vanuatu might say, use it while it lasts. Next cyclone comes in, it'll take it all out. But learn to use it safely. There's still doubts about the safety of, for example, mobile phone technology. BBC World Service did this incredible report in 1998, interviewing a retired specialist from Nokia, and he talked about the development of mobile phone technology. And then at the end of the program, the interviewer said, "Can you talk about the safety?" And he went quiet, and then he said, "Look, although I'm retired, I've had to sign a secrecy agreement, but I will say that mobile phone technology, I believe that all mobile phones should be sold with a warning like a packet of cigarettes, a health warning." Another thing is, yes, it's all, and but now it's become like a new religion. It's jolly useful. It's particularly health emergencies, weather emergencies, and things like that. But if you're going to get a whole string of cancer cases in the future, you need to think about it now. Back to basics. So people need to learn how to use these modern things safely. And there's a lot of work that's been done on this, but unfortunately it's been mostly financed by mobile phone companies.
The jury is obviously still out in terms of mobile. The UN has conducted an extensive study, and we know that the jury is still out. But you mentioned the infrastructure, mobile infrastructure particularly. I mean, it could be wiped out by any number of natural disasters in the Pacific, which is prone to these things. Is this a reason to stop this development, or is it just something that we all have to deal with?
I think again it comes back to that point. I don't think you can stop the development. Particularly in that context where you've got, if you've got a population and you've got an incentive for a telecommunication company to set up a tower or rebuild a tower after a natural disaster, they're going to do it. Depending on what the incentive is for them, then they're going to rebuild it. I mean, and it's not something that I think is either fruitful or productive to have a conversation about trying to shut down. You wouldn't talk about roads. You wouldn't say, roads have occasionally have a negative impact because murderers or rapists move along them. You say, well, that's just a reality of the situation, and we have to, engage with the reality as it is.
On the issue around, particularly around disasters, I mean, there's work that's happening in Indonesia again around mapping. OpenStreetMap is being able to map communities and use that for disaster modelling. So you're able to have this sort of open source technology that allows you to map hazards and be able to not only recover from disasters but plan and provide mitigation processes. So yeah, it's an issue, but I think there's a lot that the technology can offer. As well as the issues you raised, particularly around safety.
What if the technology itself is the potential disaster? We've got a situation on an island in southern Vanuatu at the moment where a few years ago there was a mobile phone tower built, and all the crops within a 150-yard radius have died, and they've had to replant crops elsewhere. Coconuts, maybe it's that particular tower, I don't know. But I think a lot more things like that need to be looked into by organisations that are not linked in with the technology that's being promoted.
Has this been an issue in your work? Has there been a bit of pushback based on, I guess, the perceived risks of the technology? Have you found this?
I think it's definitely worth watching. I mean, I know nothing about that case, but it's certainly something that's, if you've got that sort of situation where there's potentially crop implications, then certainly something that's worth investigating, and perhaps something from a regulatory perspective, you create a broader, a wider buffer around, if you're going to build a tower, you have to purchase the land around that area as well. I think there's, something worth looking at and potentially a regulatory implication here.
Have you seen any evidence in this in your work, Sarah?
No, I haven't. When I speak to people in the Pacific about these issues, the concerns are about social and cultural impacts.
The use of the technology.
Not impacts on health per se and not on crops.
Okay, Michael?
I think there's always a question about safeguarding the environment as well as safeguarding communities, and I think one of the things that the World Bank, ADB, and others can offer is a framework for answering these questions. There are mechanisms that can be worked through around environmental safeguard issues and social safeguard issues, and I think we can try and incorporate that into the work we're doing within and outside of a technological perspective.
Okay, thank you all, and thanks to our viewers. That brings us to the end of our discussion. Can we please thank our panellists, Sarah Logan from the Department of International Relations at the ANU, Michael Bergmann, who's the Assistant Director General for Governance and Social Development at AusAID, and Gerard McCarthy, the Director of Asia Pacific Projects at TechChange. And I'd also like to thank everyone joining us either here in Sydney or from afar. And remember, you can view this or any of our other Praxis discussions at www.worldbank.org/praxis. Until next time, I'm Oscar Sabakti. Bye for now.